Hello dolls, and welcome back to another video. This week, the 60th anniversary of the Newport Folk Festival from 1965 is coming along, and this was such a monumental moment in music, and I feel like it's gotten a lot more popular with the Bob Dylan biopic being released last year, but I really wanted to make a video all about that. I love 1960s festivals, the history of festivals, but I feel like Newport 1965 was especially interesting because of everything that happened and how it probably was the festival that changed the trajectory of 1960s music a lot, and it was almost as important as the Monterey Pop Festival and Woodstock, which are considered some of the most influential festivals of all times. So today I would like to take you back to Newport in July of 1965, when Bob Dylan went electric and changed music forever. In late July of 1965, Bob Dylan stepped on stage at the Newport Folk Festival and did the unthinkable. He plugged in an electric guitar. This moment, now approaching its 60th anniversary, has become the stuff of music legend. Newport 65 is remembered as the night the acoustic voice of a generation shocked the folk faithful by going fully electric. It marked a rupture in tradition, a thunderclap that split the decade in two. To some, it was a betrayal. To others, a bold evolution. But behind the roar of the amplifiers lay a deeper story, one about shifting ideals, cultural tension, and the growing pains of a changing era. What unfolded on that stage would reverberate far beyond Newport, reshaping not just Bob Dylan's path, but the sound and spirit of modern music itself. Chapter 1: The Newport Folk Festival. Founded in 1959 by music promoter George Wein alongside folk icons like Pete Seeger, the Newport Folk Festival quickly became the centerpiece of the 1960s folk revival. Held in Newport, Rhode Island, it was one of the first modern American music festivals and a showcase for authentic folk music, from traditional ballads and blues to new protest songs. By the mid-1960s, Newport had become a mecca for the folk community. It wasn't just about music, it was about meaning. Many Newport performers were linked to the civil rights and peace movements, and the festival had a tradition of protest spirit. The audience of 1965 would have expected acoustic guitars, earnest lyrics and sing-alongs, preserving folk as an untainted, rootsy genre. In fact, Bob Dylan himself had been a Newport favorite in 1963 and 1964, performing pure acoustic sets of songs like Blowin' in the Wind and Mr. Tambourine Man, alongside Joan Baez and other folk heroes. He was celebrated as the young bard of folk music, often heralded as the poet voice of his generation for his socially conscious anthems. Heading into the summer of 1965, no one would have expected that the reigning prince of acoustic protest would use Newport's stage to unveil a new, loud rock and roll identity. Yet by July 1965, the times they were indeed a-changin. Bob Dylan was restless and chafing at the limitations of the folk troubadour image. Earlier that year, he had started to merge rock with folk in the studio, notably on Bringing It All Back Home in March of 1965, which surprised fans with one side of electric back songs, like the Subterranean Homesick Blues. But it was the song he had released just days before heading to Newport, Like a Rolling Stone, a 6-minute torrent of electric organ riffs and surreal lyrics that sounded nothing like folk music. Still, at Newport's opening workshops in 1965, Bob Dylan stuck to what was expected of him. On Saturday, July 24th, he played a short acoustic set at the daytime workshop, just Bob with a guitar and a harmonica, everything like usual. So by this point, the festival organizers and crowd assumed his headlining appearance on Sunday night would be the same kind of set they adored, but boy were they wrong. Chapter 2: Folk Music's Sacred Ground and Dylan's Dilemma. To understand the shock of what came next, it is important to grasp how seriously folk purists took their music in the 1960s, and especially in 1965. For many in the Newport crowd, folk wasn't just a genre. It was almost a religion. It stood for authenticity, simplicity, and social integrity. Acoustic instruments and traditional songwriting were sacrosanct. The idea of adding loud electrical guitars and a rock beat into folk was, to them, downright heretical. Quote, "You don't whistle in church," as singer and Newport co-founder Theodore Bickel quipped. Quote, "You don't play rock and roll at a folk festival." In the folk scene, commercial rock music was often seen as frivolous or crassly commercial, whereas folk was the pure voice of the people. Dylan's own early career had been championed by elders like Pete Seeger and magazines like Sing Out, which viewed him as carrying on Woody Guthrie's legacy of protest songcraft. But even before Newport 1965, Dylan had begun drifting from the strict protest folk lane. He wasn't keen on being pigeonholed as a political spokesman or folk's messiah. As his former girlfriend Suze Rotolo later noted, quote, "Bob listened, absorbed, honored the old folk traditions, and then walked away. He wanted artistic freedom more than adherence to any movement's dogma." By late 1964, folk purists were already murmuring that Bob Dylan was losing touch with the movement. In fact, Sing Out editor Irvin Silber published an open letter criticizing Bob Dylan in November of 1964 from moving away from his topical protest songs. Bob Dylan's newest material had grown more poetic and personal and less about civil rights or labor strikes. He was inspired by rock and blues as much as by Guthrie's ballads. After all, Bob Dylan had grown up loving early rockers like Little Richards and Buddy Holly. Still, to the Newport faithful, he remained their folk champion, but only as long as he showed up at the festival with an acoustic guitar in his hand. What they didn't know was that Bob Dylan arrived in Newport in July of 1965 with a radical notion forming in his mind. Witnesses say he felt constrained by the expectations and annoyed by the folk establishment's stuffiness. According to one account in Howard Soon's biography, Bob Dylan, hearing how some organizers wanted to, quote, "keep Newport Electric free," declared, quote, "Well, fuck them. If they think they can keep electricity out of there, I'll do it." In other words, he was ready to plug in just to defy the folk purists. And a combination of events at the Newport Festival that weekend helped push him over the edge. Chapter 3. A Storm Brewing at Newport 65. That festival weekend, the status quo at Newport was already cracking. For the first time, a few electric acts had been booked in 1965. The Paul Butterfield Blues Band, a gritty, amplified Chicago blues set, performed at a Friday workshop, and even blues legend Lightning Hopkins played an electric guitar in his set. This did not sit well with some folk purists on the festival board. Alan Lomax, the renowned folk archivist and Newport organizer, made a snide introduction of the racially integrated Butterfield Band, a group made up of both black and white musicians, which was still seen as provocative in 1960s America, sarcastically questioning whether a young white Chicago blues band deserved its hype. Albert Grossman, who was both the Butterfields and Bob Dylan's manager, was furious at Lomax's condescension. The two older men got into a fist fight backstage, literally rolling on the ground, trading blows in front of stunned onlookers. I mean, can you imagine? As one writer later observed, quote, "The culture war that had split the decade had begun. Right then and there, the battle lines between the old guard of the folk purists and traditionalists and the new wave of electric music were drawn in the Newport dirt." Watching all this drama going down was Bob Dylan. He was friendly with Butterfield's guitarist Mike Bloomfield, and he had been impressed by the band's electric blues firepower. Bloomfield was even there to play for the Like a Rolling Stones sessions a month earlier. With one fight and a lot of buzz, Newport was abuzz that weekend, with talk of electric music invading folk territory mumbling through the crowd. Many insiders believe the Lomax versus Grossman scuffle left Bob Dylan itching to stick it to the folk establishment. According to musician Barry Goldberg, a young keyboard player who was at Newport, Dylan decided on the spur of the moment that he wanted to front an electric band on the festival's biggest stage. That was a logistical challenge. The concert was less than 24 hours away and no electric Bob Dylan band had ever even existed. Chapter 4. Assembling Dylan's electric band. On Saturday night, July 24th, Bob Dylan set his plan into motion. At a festival party, he pulled Mike Bloomfield aside and said he needed a band for the next night. Bloomfield immediately introduced his friend Barry Goldberg to Bob Dylan, vouching, quote, Barry's a great keyboard player, and suggesting why not use the Butterfield Blues Band as a backup, Dylan loved the idea. Suddenly, the dejected Goldberg, who had been dropped from Butterfield's lineup earlier that weekend, found himself being asked by Bob Dylan, the Bob Dylan, "Would you like to play with me?" His answer, "Are you kidding? Of course!" And in an instant, Dylan had formed an ad hoc electric ensemble for his set. Quote, "on a whim," as he later put it. They hastily gathered musicians. Mike Bloomfield on lead guitar, Jerome Arnold and Sam Lay, two members of the Butterfields band, on bass and drums, plus Barry Goldberg on Hammond organ. Al Cooper, who had played the organ in the studio for Like a Rolling Stone, was also at Newport. He'd come as a spectator and eagerly jumped in once he heard what was brewing. He actually ended up swapping over to bass for Like a Rolling Stone, since Jerome Arnold was struggling with the chord changes. Don't get me wrong, Arnold was an incredible solid bluesman. However, he was quite unfamiliar with Bob Dylan's new rock style, and so I think that is why they made the change. They rehearsed through the night at a mansion that festival producer George Wine had rented, working up a short set of songs: Maggie's Farm, Like a Rolling Stone, and Phantom Engineer, an early version of It Takes a Lot to Love, It Takes a Train to Cry. This was going to be Bob Dylan's first ever live electric set, and they only had these 3 numbers ready, rough and ragged, but full of energy. Even the sound check on Sunday afternoon was eventful. On stage in the afternoon light, Bob Dylan, looking cool and confident in a polka dot shirt, pointy boots and sunglasses. The sound levels were a point of contention. Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul and Mary, who was emceeing the night, kept yelling at the band to turn the volume down during sound check. Each time Yarrow barked to lower the volume, Bloomfield would glare at him as if he was thinking, "Just you wait." Bloomfield had little patience for the pompous folk guy, as he referred to him, telling him how to play. Meanwhile, on another corner of the stage, Grossman and Lomax nearly came to blows again, resuming their argument about electric music's place at Newport. It was chaos. Peter Yarrow was shouting. 2 grown men were wrestling in the wings, and Bob Dylan, in the middle of it all, is calmly plugging in his Fender Stratocaster. As Barry Goldberg observed, quote, "I sensed that a battle line was being drawn, and we all were on a mission together. Bob was our leader. They were the rock and roll raiders, about to storm the folk fortress." Chapter 5, July 25th, 1965, the night Bob Dylan went electric. And then Sunday evening arrived. A crowd of about 17,000 people packed the Newport Festival field. The lineup of that night was a folk lover's dream. Legends like Pete Seeger, the Freedom Singers, and the searing voice of Odetta had performed. Finally, it was time for the festival's headliner, Bob Dylan. Peter Yarrow took the mic to introduce his friend Bobby. By all accounts, what happened next was electrifying, in every sense. Dylan strode on stage, wearing a black leather jacket and carrying a sunburst Fender Stratocaster, an electric guitar instead of his trusty acoustic. At his side came Bloomfield, Cooper, and the rest of the band, plugging in amps under the glare of the stage lights. In that moment, a ripple of confusion and anticipation swept through the audience. This was not the image of Dylan they were used to. Where was the lone poet with an acoustic guitar? Dylan wasted no time. The band launched into a blistering, amplified version of Maggie's Farm. Instead of the gentle strumming the crowd might have expected, they were hit with Mike Bloomfield's piercing electric guitar riff and pounding rhythm sections. Bob Dylan leaned into the microphone and shrieked the opening lyrics, "I ain't gonna work on Maggie's farm no more." It was loud, raw, and rocking, sending a shockwave through the audience, as one attendee described it. For a moment, many were simply stunned. Some in the crowd began cheering. There was a contingent of younger fans who loved the Beatles and electric rock and dug this new sound. But a significant portion of the audience began booing almost immediately, and others sat in open-mouthed disbelief. One spectator later said it was like watching someone, quote, betray the cause in real time. As the song went on, the mixed reactions intensified. Choruses of boos and scattered shouts could be heard even over the music. People yelled, "Sell out," and "Get rid of that band" from the audience. For the folk purist, this electric noise was a slap in the face. Quote, "This wasn't the Dylan folkies had paid to see," wrote historian Evan Andrews. Quote, "A musical betrayal, proved that he had abandoned the authenticity of folk for the glitz and glamour of rock and roll." The sense of betrayal was palpable among many older folk fans. Bob Dylan had been their standard bearer of truth, and now he was turning his back on the folkies, as Barry Goldberg later wrote of those furious faces in the crowd. In Goldberg's words, quote, "For years Bob had done his folk thing, and now, all of this sudden, it signified the end of the folk era as they knew it. Bob's performance was closing that chapter, but he was also opening a new chapter, creating folk rock." In other words, Bob Dylan's very presence on that stage and that night with an electric guitar symbolized a changing of guard, something bigger than one concert. On stage, despite the heckling, Bob and the band plowed ahead into the next song. Fittingly, Like a Rolling Stone. The single had only been out for 5 days, but many in the crowd knew it, and some likely already resented its radio-friendly rock sound. As they performed it, the mix of cheers and jeers continued. Barry Goldberg later recalled the moment in a 2022 interview with The Forward, saying, quote, "I wasn't deaf. I heard the cheers mixing with the boos, and I knew there were some people out there that dug what we were doing. The others weren't even listening. They were in shock, reacting to their feeling of betrayal." In the wings, things were just as dramatic. Various accounts describe Pete Seeger, the folk patriarch, having a meltdown about the sound. The myth, often repeated over the years, is that Seeger was so infuriated by Bob Dylan's electric set that he grabbed an axe and tried to cut the power cable. While that exact image is exaggerated, Seeger himself admitted that he was fuming about the sound. Quote, "If I had an axe, I'd cut the cable right now," he growled, complaining that the mix was so distorted he, quote, "could not understand a word Dylan was singing." Seeger later insisted his anger was at the technicians for the bad sound quality, not at Bob Dylan's musical choice. And indeed, the sound mix was far from ideal. Mike Bloomfield's guitar was cranked so loud it often overpowered Bob Dylan's vocals. But in the heat of the moment, all the audience saw was Pete Seeger visibly upset and an audience booing. To them, it looked like a folk mutiny against Dylan's new direction. Meanwhile, the band on stage responded in true rock and roll fashion. Rather than shrink from the boos, Mike Bloomfield turned his amplifier up even higher. Every time a heckler shouted, he would rip into another ferocious guitar lick. He was, as Goldberg put it, quote, "blasting them in the name of rock and roll." Dylan's singing grew even more intense. He shouted the defiant lyrics of Like a Rolling Stone, How Does It Feel, into the night, seemingly answering the hostile crowd with sneering passion. Band members of his makeshift band later recalled that they felt like warriors on a mission to back up the leader of a gang. It was an us against them situation, and Bob Dylan wasn't about to back down. They then launched into the third electric number, Phantom Engineer, which Bob decided to release as It Takes a Lot to Love, It Takes a Train to Cry on Highway 61 Revisited in August of the same year. This was a slower, bluesier song, and by some reports the performance was a bit rough. After the high voltage of the first two songs, the band plodded through this more unfamiliar tune. As it ended, Bob Dylan abruptly said, "Thank you," and walked off the stage, the band following behind. In total, the electric set had lasted maybe 15 minutes and covered just 3 songs. For a headliner at a major festival, it was an unusually short appearance, and the crowd wasn't sure if it was actually over. Some clapped and many booed as they left the stage. The mix of noise was even louder and more intense now than when they had begun. Backstage, Peter Yarrow was frantic. This couldn't be how the night ended. The schedule was running tight, but he knew the audience expected more from Bob Dylan. He grabbed the microphone and tried to calm the crowd, announcing that, quote, "Bobby is going to come back and play a song on acoustic." The audience's booing quickly turned into chanting for Bob Dylan's return, and at first Dylan was reportedly reluctant. He may have felt hurt by the reception, or simply didn't want to concede. "What are you doing to me?" he snapped at Yarrow when being pressed to return to the stage. Nevertheless, after a few minutes, Bob Dylan indeed returned to the stage, this time alone and with an acoustic guitar in his hands. Perhaps he had realized that this was the only way he could satisfy the folk diehards. Ironically though, he had to borrow an acoustic guitar. Since he hadn't planned on needing one, he hadn't packed one. And in a famous little moment, Yarrow asked the crowd if anyone had a guitar to spare that Bob Dylan could use, or an harmonica, prompting a rain of harmonicas from fans tossing them on stage towards Bob. With the suitable guitar and harp in hand, Bob Dylan stepped to the mic. The crowd quieted in anticipation. He then delivered two poignant acoustic songs, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, and Mr. Tambourine Man. Accounts vary on the order. Some say he reversed them, but he did indeed play both. These performances were classic Dylan, haunting lyrics, just voice and guitar, and the audience that had been booing moments before now listened raptly. Many later noted the symbolic choice of It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, as if Dylan were telling the folk crowd that their era was ending and it's all over now. With that gentle goodbye, Dylan left the stage for the final time that night. He had started a revolution in 15 electric minutes, and then, just as suddenly, he was gone. Bob Dylan did not return to Newport for 37 years after 1965. That night, he packed up and left immediately. Barry Goldberg, elated and exhausted, remembers walking off stage feeling like a hero. Quote, "We had done our thing, taking this momentous jump into the musical unknown," he said. "I knew that some kind of force had come along and touched me, and I wasn't going to fuck with it." Bob Dylan himself was whisked away off into the night, leaving the shocked festival buzzing behind with controversy. The immediate concert drama was over, but the aftershock had only just begun. Chapter 6: Immediate Aftermath, Fallout and Conflicted Reactions. In the days and weeks right after Newport 65, a firestorm of debate raged through the music community. The performance that some dubbed a fiasco was front-page news in the folk world. What exactly had happened, and what did it mean? Was Bob Dylan's electric stunt a betrayal, a flop, or the herald of a new era? Depending on whom you asked, you'd get very different answers. Many prominent folk figures were harshly critical. Ewan MacColl, a respected British folk singer, sneered at Dylan, saying he had become, quote, an imitation and had forsaken the meaningful songwriting. Sing Out magazine's Irvin Silber, who had been wary of Bob Dylan's direction even before Newport, saw the show as confirmation that Bob Dylan had, quote, lost touch with the audience and the cause. The Providence Journal famously complained that in Dylan's new electrified music, quote, the words are mattering less than the beat. The critic lamented that what he used to stand for, whether one agreed with it or not, was much cleaner than what he stands for now. Perhaps he stands for himself. This captures the sense of confusion people were feeling. Bob Dylan's folk fans used to ascribe him to a mission, the voice of protest and the prophet of the downtrodden. But now he seemed to be going his own way, unbeholden to any cause but his own artistic vision. To some folk purists, that was basically selfish, and they looked at it as him simply selling out. So, a lot of these reactions and outrage have to do with the self-perception of folk. Folk music traditionally came from the working class and was about fighting for cause and meaning. It was protest music, people's music, music that rejected commercialism in favor of truth. In the 1960s, especially within the American folk revival, the genre became deeply entwined with the civil rights movement, anti-war activism, and labor struggles. It prided itself on being authentic, raw, and unpolished, just a voice, a guitar, and something that needed to be said. To many in the folk community, Bob Dylan represented that ideal. He was the young prophet, writing songs that sounded like they came straight from the picket line of the front steps of a protest rally. So when he stepped out in a leather jacket backed by electric guitars, snarling lyrics through distortion and amplifiers, it wasn't just a musical change, it felt like a philosophical betrayal. Going electric wasn't seen as artistic growth, it was seen by some as Dylan turning his back on the cause. Rock music at the time was considered flashy, commercial, and apolitical, a world of screaming teenagers and top 40 radio. To purists, it lacked the moral weight and historical roots of folk. So Dylan's shift wasn't just a sound shift, it was a perceived alignment with the very machine folk music had always stood against. The audience didn't just fear change. They feared that their most powerful voice had been co-opted, that the movement had lost its figurehead to fame, ego, or money, and in a scene where ideals mattered more than image and purpose mattered more than polish, that felt like more than disappointment. It felt like a sellout. And even some of Bob Dylan's musical peers from the folk circuit were quite uncomfortable. As mentioned earlier, Theodore Bickel once joked that playing rock and roll at a folk festival was like whistling in a church. And that comment really captures how a lot of people felt at Newport. They felt like Bob Dylan's electric performance violated something sacred about the folk tradition. To them, Bob Dylan had breached folk decorum and betrayed the cause. One disappointed fan at Bob Dylan's infamous 1966 concert in Manchester, the one where another one famously shouted "Judas," later said, quote, "We made him and he betrayed the cause." Though spoken a year later, the sentiment echoed what many folk devotees had already felt at Newport. Dylan, once their golden boy, the poetic voice of protest, and now he was venturing into something louder, murkier, and more individual. To them, it wasn't just a change in sound, it was a personal betrayal, as if he owed them eternal allegiance to the acoustic struggle. At the same time, others defended Bob Dylan, or at least questioned the booing. Many witnesses, including Pete Seeger, once he'd cooled down and later spoke quite often about this in interviews actually, pointed out that a lot of the booing was likely due to the technical issues. The sound was terrible at points, and the set was so short that people felt frustrated, not necessarily enraged just by the concept of electric music. And there's actually quite a lot of evidence to back this up. The following year, at Newport 1966, multiple electric acts played, including The Loving Spoonful, Howling Wolf, Chuck Berry, and others, and nobody booed at all. In fact, the New York Times review of Newport 1966 noted the warm reception of folk rock as a sign of, quote, the growing acceptance of the amalgamation of contemporary folk songs with electric instruments. What a difference 1 year made! This suggests that Bob Dylan's 1965 set was as much a shock of the new and unexpected as anything. By 1966, folk audiences had adjusted. The initial trauma was over. As music critic Robert Shelton observed, The Loving Spoonful getting cheered in '66, quote, reflected Newport's growing acceptance of folk rock and other hybrids. In short, Bob Dylan had kicked the door open in 1965, and within a year, that door was wide open. Newport had plugged in and moved on. Nonetheless, in the immediate years after 1965, Bob Dylan indeed felt ostracized by much of the folk establishment. He essentially left the pure folk scene and never really returned to it in the same way. For a time, he even stopped writing overt protest songs altogether. Some disillusioned fans at the time derided him as a sellout who traded social commentary for pop stardom. A few others of the hardcore Dylanites simply couldn't let go of the betrayal narrative. This backlash ironically reinforced Dylan's own rationale for going electric. He hated being put on a pedestal or made to serve someone else's agenda. An artist can't be made to serve a theory was a sentiment associated with Dylan around this time, and later echoed in accounts of the incident. He wanted the freedom to change, even if it meant leaving some fans behind. And indeed, Bob Dylan's commercial success only grew after Newport. The controversy did not derail his career. If anything, it drew even more attention to his new music. Within a month, in August of 1965, he released the album Highway 61 Revisited, a fully electric rock album anchored by Like a Rolling Stone, which by then had become a top 10 hit on the Billboard charts. Critics who panned his Newport show had to admit that the studio recordings were brilliant. Highway 61 was lauded as an instant classic, proving that Dylan's songwriting genius was intact even with amplifiers behind it. The following spring of 1966, he doubled down with the sprawling double LP Blonde on Blonde, which pushed rock music into a wild new territory. By that time, many initial skeptics had to admit that electric Bob Dylan was as artistically potent as acoustic Bob Dylan. As History.com notes, quote, "Many former critics were forced to admit that electric instruments had not damped his flair for writing rebellious songs or poetic, quotable lyrics. In other words, Bob Dylan had shown that rock and roll music could carry the same depth and meaning of folk, a seismic validation for the emerging genre of folk rock." Chapter 7: The Ripple Effect: How Music Changed After Newport 65. Beyond Dylan's own career, that fateful night in Newport of 1965 is often cited as a turning point in popular music. It symbolizes the moment when the sensibilities of the 1960s shifted. The folk revival gave way to the rise of rock as the leading voice of the youth culture, now infused with the lyricism and conscience of folk. By going electric, Dylan essentially bridged two worlds, and an industry rushed to follow. Consider that even before Newport, Bob Dylan's influence was nudging others toward folk rock. In the spring of 1965, the Byrds had electrified his song, Mr. Tambourine Man, and scored a #1 hit, effectively inaugurating folk rock on the radio. After Newport, that trend exploded. Suddenly, record labels were signing bands that could blend meaningful lyrics with electric guitars. Simon and Garfunkel had originally released The Sound of Silence as an acoustic track in 1964, but it went largely unnoticed. Then, in '65, producer Tom Wilson secretly overdubbed it with an electric guitar and drums. Without the duo's knowledge, a Boston radio station began playing the new version, and by early '66, it had soared to #1 on the charts, proving that folk and electric could not only coexist, but thrive. The message was clear. Contemporary audiences wanted the best of both worlds. Artists like The Loving Spoonful, Buffalo Springfield, The Mamas and the Papas, and many others emerged in 1965 and '66, all hybridizing folk influences with rock and pop arrangements. The Beatles themselves were inspired by Dylan around this time, though coming from the other direction, incorporating Dylan's folk-influenced introspective lyrics into their rock music. The cross-pollination that Newport 65 epitomized helped usher in the lyrics-driven rock era that defined the late 1960s. Songs got longer, deeper, and more socially aware, because Bob Dylan proved you could marry literary songwriting to rock and roll and succeed. And at Newport, the festival itself quickly adapted. In 1966, as mentioned, they happily invited electric blues and rock acts, and no one thought about that twice. By 1967 and later on 1969, the Newport Folk Festival lineups included not just traditional folk singers, but electric bluesmen like Muddy Waters and even genre-blending artists. A very famous moment was in 1969 when Johnny Cash introduced the new country folk songwriter Chris Christopherson on stage. The strict no electric ethos was gone. In a sense, Newport 65 was the catalyst the festival needed to evolve with the times. The folk revival's peak had passed, and the late 1960s were more about folk rock and the emerging singer-songwriter movement that followed. After 1969, the original Newport Folk Festival actually went on hiatus. The tumult of the era and financial issues led to it being discontinued until a revival in 1985. But by then, the folk festival concept itself had changed. Future Newport lineups would routinely feature artists with full bands, drum kits, and electric amps, alongside acoustic acts. The wall between folk and rock had been permanently knocked down. Chapter 8: Bob Dylan's Trajectory Post-1965. For Bob Dylan personally, the electric Newport set was the beginning of a new chapter of artistic freedom. But it came at a cost. He continued to face pockets of booing and hostility on his 1965 and 66 world tours whenever he played electric. His backup group, mostly musicians known as the Hawks, who later became the band, endured nightly catcalls from folk loyalists who bought tickets hoping to see the old Dylan. This climaxed in the notorious Judas incident in Manchester a year later in May of 1966, when one angry fan's accusation prompted Dylan to sneer, "I don't believe you, you're a liar," into the mic and launched into a furiously loud like a Rolling Stone. These confrontations were captured in documentaries like No Direction Home, painting a vivid picture of an artist forging ahead against the gale of public opinion. Dylan later reflected on that period somewhat ruefully. He hadn't set out to insult folk fans, but he had to follow his own muse. As one close associate noted, the backlash actually shook Bob Dylan more than he let on. He was hurt that some fans refused to grow with him. And then everything changed in July of 1966, a year after Newport. Bob Dylan got into a serious motorcycle accident. This is often reported, however, the clear circumstances and how hurt he truly was isn't really that openly discussed, so it's just known that he had this motorcycle accident. Some say it was really bad, others said he got away somewhat fine, but what matters is that this really had him put a pause on touring. His accident forced him off the road and into seclusion in Woodstock, New York. In that period, away from the spotlight, he surprised everyone yet again. Instead of more raucous work, he released John Wesley Harding in 1967, a mellow, rustic album with a quiet folk country flavor, almost a retreat from the excess of the rock scene he had helped ignite. In 1969, he went to Nashville and recorded Nashville Skyline, an outright country album, completed with a smooth-voiced Dylan practically crooning. It was clear by now that reinvention had become Bob Dylan's constant. The shock of 65 was just the first of many times he would zig when others expected him to zag. Over time, Dylan continued to evolve musically, turning to country music and drifting through numerous styles throughout the rest of his career. He was never again going to be the movement-defined protest singer of his early years. Newport had set him free from that box, for better or for worse. And what of that acoustic voice of a generation mantle? Others picked it up where Dylan left off. Artists like Joan Baez, Phil Ochs, Buffy St. Marie, and later Bruce Springsteen or John Lennon in their own ways, but arguably the whole notion of a single generation spokesperson in folk music faded as the 1960s progressed. Dylan's departure from the role signaled a fragmentation. After him, rock music and folk music both had many voices and subgenres. The protest spirit certainly lived on in rock anthems like For What It's Worth or Joan Baez's continuing activism, but it was no longer concentrated in one young bard with a guitar. Dylan had walked away from being a leader of a movement, and by electrifying, he sort of handed the baton to rock bands and a new generation of songwriters. In the long, Dylan's 1965 electric revolution came to be celebrated, not scorned. His once controversial albums from that period, Highway 61, Blonde on Blonde, are now routinely hailed as some of the greatest rock albums of all time. The folk rock boom he sparked opened the door for countless artists to experiment. By the 1970s, it was completely normal for a singer-songwriter to play acoustic one song and electric on the next, thanks in part to Dylan. And by the time decades passed, even Newport forgave him. In 2002, Bob Dylan finally returned to the Newport Folk Festival stage for the first time since that infamous night. Amusingly, he performed in a wig and fake beard, perhaps a slight inside joke referencing how he had been disguised by a new image in 1965. The crowd in 2002 welcomed him as a living legend. No boos, only cheers. Pete Seeger, before his passing, repeatedly clarified clarified that he harbored no ill will toward Bob Dylan's music. In fact, Seeger later honored Dylan as someone who broadened the definition of folk. Time has a way of softening old wounds and correcting myths. The Dylan Goes Electric moment is now seen as a pivotal juncture in music history, when an artist bravely defied convention and, in doing so, propelled music into a new era. Chapter 9, Legacy, the moment that split the 60s. Looking back from the vantage of 60 years later, the 1965 Newport incident feels almost symbolic, like a rock and roll baptism divided the old world from the new. One author, Elijah Wald, even subtitled his book about it, The Night That Split the 60s. It's a poetic way to describe it. July 25th of 1965 clave the decade into before, when the folk revival ideals reigned supreme, and when pop and folk were separate spheres, and after, when the cultural revolution of the 1960s, with amplified music and blurred genres, fully took off. The jubilee of this event finds us in a world where the idea of an acoustic folk singer not eventually going electric almost seems odd. Virtually every folk-influenced musician since Bob Dylan has used amplification and contemporary productions without any controversy. And that freedom exists partly because Bob Dylan took on the initial storm of controversies and criticism. Was it the start of something new? Absolutely. In one short set, Bob Dylan had demonstrated that rock music could carry the weight of meaningful lyrics and that folk music could be loud and modern. The music industry took note and the creative floodgates opened. Within a year, popular music had evolved at breakneck speed. From the psychedelic rock of 1967 to country rock, to the introspective folk rock of singer-songwriters in the early 70s, and Dylan's electrified folk rock was a key catalyst. As folk rock pioneer Roger McGuinn of The Byrds said, quote, "We didn't know it at the time, but we were part of a revolution. And at Newport 1965, that revolution had a flashpoint moment." And maybe it's best to leave the last word to Dylan himself. In 1966, still facing the echoes of those boos, he sang a line that seemed aimed right at the divide between him and the folk faithful. "Something is happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones?" Back in July of 65, something was indeed stirring strange, electric, unfamiliar, and many in the Newport crowd couldn't quite name it. But time would. Dylan plugging in was no mere rebellion. It was a thunderclap that split the sky and signaled the storm to come. One chapter ended with the words, "It's all over now, baby blue." But in its place, something new took root. Rock and folk collided, blurred and bloomed into something larger than either on their own. A single set, 15 minutes long, and the axis of popular music shifted forever. It was the sound of tradition giving way to transformation, raw, electric, and utterly unstoppable. And just like that, the folk hero became something else entirely, and music was never the same again. So that is it for today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I've been wanting to make this video ever since A Complete Unknown came out, because I feel like while the film does a great job, I've made a video all about the film, I'm gonna link it here for you. It ends at this really crucial moment, and I like it. It's kind of like the first chapter of Dylan's career, but I think it is so interesting how Bob Dylan going electric launched a whole new genre and a whole new type of music. And it's the music that has gotten so popular over the years, and I just can't help but wonder what would have happened if Bob Dylan never had the courage to step away from his folk roots. It's just, I don't know, it's so interesting, and I truly believe that what happened on that night ignited a lot of the late 1960s music that is now so beloved and that is such a big part of my life because I adore it so deeply. I would love to know what you think. Now, I'm no music critic, nothing like that, but I just wanted to tell this story because I feel like a lot of people now know Newport 65 more because of the film, and not many know what actually happened, because while the film is close, it's not really telling the full story and painting the full picture of what actually happened. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the video. If There were a lot of cuts. I want to apologize. I'm in my 9th month of pregnancy and breathing is just hard. After speaking a couple of sentences, I need to pause and just breathe for a moment. And then also, unfortunately, we have construction workers doing work on the building. And even though I spoke with them at the beginning of the week and asked them, and they told me that they weren't going to do anything loud today, they did, which is fine. They just need to get their job done. But if there's any weird noise in the background, that is on them. And I unfortunately cannot change anything about it. So yeah, I would love to know what you think about Bob Dylan going electric and the whole Newport Festival. I have to say, and I think I've said this many times before, if I could travel through time back to visit festivals, place number 1 would be the Monterey Pop Festival in 67, place number 2 would be Woodstock 69, and place number 3 would be the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I would love you to give it a thumbs up and maybe even share it with a friend. It supports me, it supports the channel, and it would truly mean the world. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine, take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next video, where my hair won't be as messy anymore because I will finally have gotten my haircut that I'm looking very much forward to. Bye, dolls!